Happy 2025, everyone. We are starting a new year. And to start the year, I wanted to thank everyone who is a member of my Patreon page. By going to patreon.com, setlisting Bruce, for as little as $1 a month, you can support the podcast and help me cover the expenses of doing this. So I want to thank the people like Andre Provost, Amy Brooks, David Karikis, C.K. Westbrook, Sean Poole, Dave and Jennifer Von Ebers, Jeff Ulmer, Sylvan Groth, Liz Bronson, Yetta, Steve Van Sack, Rob Barnett, Bella Pori, John Munson, Bessie Hodges, Levi Petrie, Elizabeth Brunson, Stephen Malio, Holly Mack, Steve Rogers, Dale Hosek, Terry Smith, Chris Bloom, and Mary Thomas. Thank you guys for being part of the Patreon family. And now, on with the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of Set Lusting Bruce, your podcast all about Bruce Springsteen, his music, and mostly his fans. I am your host, Jesse Jackson. I would normally say we're getting off the Bruce Springsteen train because I have a writer that's here talking about her new book, but she said, I love Bruce. So we're going to do both. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell us a little about yourself.
So, my name is Sarah Seltzer. I'm a New Yorker. I'm a mom. I'm a writer and editor. And I'm a huge Bruce fan. You can't see it, but I'm looking at Bruce and Clarence right here.
Nice.
We have a giant Born to Run poster. And I just published my first novel, which is a rock and roll novel. So, it's very exciting to combine my love of pop culture and music with writing and fiction.
Yeah, I am really looking forward to talking about that. So, Sarah, where
Mhm.
did you grow up? And what kind of music were your parents listening to when you were younger?
Great question. So grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, right near Central Park and like the Museum of Natural History. And my parents were big music listeners. Basically, we always had the classical station of the New York City's classical station, which is run by the New York Times, actually on all the time, like in the background always. But also very big fans of my parents are baby boomers, so we're talking like you open their vinyl collection. We've got Simon and Garfunkel, Aretha Franklin, a lot of those original Beatles LPs that are only found in North America, like Something New and
Mm.
Beatles 65. My mom had all of those. Joan Baez, um, Stevie Wonder, just sort of all your Rolling Stones, all your classic boomer stuff. And among those is Bruce as well. So just a very, very steady diet of that kind of music as a kid, as well as the classical, the opera, Broadway. We listened to a lot of Broadway soundtracks. So it was really, really varied and frequent.
Great. So I embraced all their music.
I did. I think when I was younger, I found the classical a bit more boring, and I professed and the opera to love rock, but it was all part of the fabric of what we
Yeah.
were listening to. So as I got older, I began to appreciate some of everything as well. But certainly when I was 12 and 13 and starting to discover the radio on my own and pop music of my time, which was the mid 90s, that era of music, the biggest acts were like the Counting Crows and the Wallflowers and Jewel and Sarah McLachlan. They were all so deliberately throwing back to my parents' music. So it was really interesting to kind of be getting into both at the same time.
You know, I tell this story often that my guests tend to be generally two categories. They're the people that kind of embrace their parents' music, and as they became a teenager, they just expanded their, you know, pattern in listening to all these bands, or the others that couldn't stand their parents' music. And then when you turn 35, you go, wow, that guy Johnny Cash dad liked a lot, he's pretty good, you know.
Right.
So it sounds like from the pop rock side, you always kind of embraced that. Classical took a little bit longer.
That's right. I think you're absolutely right about those two different categories.
Hmm?
But I certainly, for me and my friends, I think it was just like rating our parents' album collection was a sport. We couldn't believe it was, because we were starting to rebel socially and as teenagers, and then just like sort of the disconnect between like, but also their music is really, really cool. And they're like the way they dress was really cool. And it's very funny to see my oldest kid now is only 8, but he's so annoyed by all the 90s nostalgia that's happened in the culture. He's like, why is
Yeah.
everyone always talking about the 90s? And I'm like, you don't understand. Like in the 90s, everyone was talking about the 60s and 70s.
Yes,
We were all
exactly.
wearing our mom's bell bottoms to school. It was very weird.
I like to ask this about writers. Were you raised in a family of readers?
Yes, my parents and brother are attorneys, actually.
Okay.
I'm the only writer qua writer in the family, but everyone is in the word to the verbal trade, right? So everyone's writing and talking and arguing for their job. So my parents have an entire wall of our living room with bookshelves, and they've reached a point now where they like the bookshelves are double lined with books. They
Yeah.
have all their like mysteries on the outside, and then you pull a whole row of mysteries out, and there's like another row of books from the 70s behind them.
Oh, how
Like
fun.
huge, huge readers. Had all the encyclopedias also, like the multi-volume physical encyclopedias you used to have instead of looking things up online, and my grandparents as well. So I was just surrounded by books and encouraged to read. We were encouraged to read above our level, and it was no problem for us to read grown-up books when we were in 5th or 6th grade, and they would help us understand them if they were tricky.
Were there some favorite writers for you growing up?
And I loved a lot of just the classic YA books growing up. So we didn't have Harry Potter back when I was a kid, but
Right.
it was like the Chronicles of Narnia, and we really were into Lord of the Rings in my house. Really, really. My dad read The Hobbit to us, and then he read us the whole trilogy. The
Oh,
book he read out loud. It took a year. So we really into and then I would start reread them as a teenager, like every year and a half or so myself. And I really loved like Anne of Green Gables and Little Women, the Little House on the Prairie books. Um, so basically, for any kind of beloved classic YA book, I love it. But I also loved reading like The Babysitter's Club and like The Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew and all those mystery Encyclopedia Brown, all the mystery series and stuff that were fun for kids too.
is there a book you remember kind of saying, "Oh wow, this is something unique that's just mine"?
That's a great question. I discovered a Scholastic book fair called, it's probably out of print now. It was about um, a British girl who gets sent to the United States during World War II and
Okay.
lives with an American family. And then the book is about her return to the UK as a teenager and how much looser everything was in the States and how difficult it is for her to come back to this society that's much stiffer and much more strict about women, like young women, and how they should behave. And it was called Back Home. Again, I don't know anyone else who's read this book, but I read it like over and over again. Because it was just, one of those classic YA stories of displacement and family and adolescent rebellion. She goes to a boarding school and she breaks all the rules. It was a lot of fun.
It sounds really fun.
Yeah,
That's great. So, did you know you wanted to be a writer early?
I did. I mean, I always say I wanted to be a writer. I also wanted to be an actress and a bunch of other things too. And like, studied bugs. And I had various other careers, but the writer was the one that kind of stuck all the way through those different phases. And part of that is because like all these heroines in these books like wanted to be writers. And Jo March from Little Women and
Yeah.
Emily of New Moon is the other big series by the Anne of Green Gables author, Ellen Montgomery, and she's all about becoming a writer. And I was really obsessed with that. So I kind of felt that, well, if they're going to be writers, then I should be one too. But I mean, also, a lot of writers joke that sort of you get cursed when, one of your teachers says, in third or fourth grade, oh, you're a really great writer. You should write. And you hear praise as a kid, and you're like, okay, that's what I'm gonna do. And then you're ruined.
I love that. I've never heard that before, but that's pretty funny.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
So thanks so much for all those, check pluses or
Do you
whatever.
do you recall like when you really felt like you went to a different level? Like when you wrote something the first time that you went, "Wow, I've kind of stepped up my game. I'm really proud of this."
I had when I was in eighth grade, I was the first time I had both my English and history teachers were like pushed me. It was the first time I'd ever had writing teachers who weren't just like, oh wow, you can really write. They actually really challenged me. And to have both those subjects at the same time, I remember just feeling, both kind of surprised that I that I wasn't getting immediately positive feedback, but also feeling this just amazing feeling of, you know, going back and rewriting my papers and trying to make them better and my stories and wanting to make the, impress these teachers. And that was sort of my first relationship with editors, kind of. So that was an amazing feeling coming out of that year with those two teachers.
Yeah, I can imagine that all of a sudden they're pushing you to say, Sarah, you know, you this is half-ass, right? I mean, they
Yeah,
wouldn't have said it that way, but right, like you can do better than this.
you can do
And I'm
better.
gonna demand you, I'm gonna push you to do more.
Right,
And
right.
I'm sure that's a little bit uncomfortable, but also sounds like you stepped up to the challenge.
Yes, it was so encouraging. And there was this one history teacher in particular where I think she gave a lot of us that same experience of, suddenly for the first time ever getting our rough drafts back with like, a B or a C and trying really hard because she was trying to get us ready for high school. I guess it was eighth grade and she was pushing everyone to
Hmm.
make their essays deeper and more thoughtful. She got a sort of cult around her because she really did sort of identify the kids who really wanted to write and give all of us a hard time and make us all better.
That's
So
awesome. So flipping
lovely
back to,
Southern accent too, which
yeah, flipping back to music, can you remember you talked about Bruce was part of your growing up, but is there a moment where his music spoke to you in a different way than some of the other artists? And if so, can you explain what about it spoke to you?
that's a really good question. So I think, so much was that he was our car trip, one of our big car trip artists as a
Okay,
family. We were listening to Born to Run and Born in the USA were the two cassette
sure.
tapes we had that we listened to all the time. And so I loved Bruce and I thought he was great, but it was really seeing him live for the first time, which I realize is kind of a cliche for Bruce fans, but we got to see him at Madison Square Garden during that stand of shows he did in
Yeah.
2000. And I remember, I think it was, If I Should Fall Behind or one of the songs. I remember we were on the floor, but kind of towards the back, and I was standing on my seat because I couldn't really see. And just this like transcendent feeling, and I was with my parents and my brother. It was a family trip and just, which is kind of unusual. And the whole thing was, I felt like it was like a religious experience. And the funny story about that show that my mother never fails to remind us is that she like got up at like 4 in the morning or something to go get the tickets. We're at a Nobody Beats the Wiz on the Upper West Side at Ticketmaster, and she was like in a sleeping bag on the street. And her cousin, like the third cousin or something, came up to her and stared at her like, "Why is this lady camped out for Bruce tickets actually my cousin?" And then he walked away because he couldn't believe it. And that was the beginning of the obsession.
I love that story. I've often said that, and I've done this a lot, so you kind of run into categories like I talked about seeing kids, they're growing up with their parents, but I say this tongue in cheek, there's two kinds of people. The people that see Bruce the first time and go, wow, that was a long show. And then everyone else who says, oh my gosh, when can I do this again?
Yeah,
I have to go do this again.
yes, exactly.
And yeah, there's a reason why cliches happen and tropes happen,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, there is a lot about that.
Yeah. I think about when I took my husband to his first Bruce show. you know, we weren't because we weren't married yet. We were dating or we were engaged, and it was back at Madison Square Garden, and it was for I guess for the Magic
Okay.
tour. And I just was like looking at his face as much as I was looking at Bruce because I just wanted to see if how how it hit him and how it was so fun to see him have that experience of like, oh wow, this is actually like not just, I mean, he loved Bruce too. This is not just good, this is unbelievable.
I always preface this, Sarah, with the amount of times you've seen Bruce perform live is a poor barometer of how big of a fan you are. But do you count how many times?
I was trying to do it before I came on. So when my first kid was a baby, it was like around 20 times. So I think now we're at like 25 maybe or
Okay.
23. So I
Hmm.
saw him 3 times on the last tour. Uh,
Okay.
I know there was a long break.
Yeah.
We're in the early 20s.
What'd you think of the last tour?
I loved it. I recognize that he's not running and jumping all over the stage the way he used to be,
Yes.
but I'm still really just the energy was really good and really grateful to be there and still kind of get that feeling by the end of like I need to go back.
Yes.
So
I saw him 3 times in 23. Only saw him once in 24. And so it was toward the end of 24, and they did that Road Diary, the documentary, right? And by the end of it, I was going, do I have any miles that could get me to Canada? Like, is there a ticket? And
yeah,
I was like, because it made me want to go back. I had that itch.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
So, I did notice on the last tour that the fans didn't I felt like they didn't know all the little like there wasn't as much of that like fan like the first couple times I saw him and everyone was doing Badland like
Right.
just like completely in sync. The whole stadium would be like
Yeah.
totally coordinated, and there was a little less of that this time, but people were still rocking out and having fun. So
Yes. And you think about it, it had been, I guess, what, 16, the last tour for
yeah,
the river. And then so it was 23. So, it had been a lot of years. And
yeah,
there were a lot of people, this was their first time.
yep,
Yeah, it's
yeah,
great.
yeah.
So are there, and obviously the answer is all of them, but are there albums or songs that mean a lot to you that you go to back when you're needing emotional support or, comfort?
It really varies with any great artist. And this is true of like Jane Austen and George Eliot or Bob Dylan. I feel that way about Bruce too, that there's an album for every phase of your life, song for every phase of your life. So I actually find myself listening to Streets of Philadelphia now again. And I love, yeah, it really changes. Like Prove It All Might is like a pump me up song that I like is always on all my workout
Yeah.
mixes or my get motivated mixes. And there's just, yeah, I'm trying to think of like what my personal favorites are. I think my favorite albums, I mean, are probably very cliche, but probably Born to Run in Darkness.
Yeah.
Um, and
And there's
yeah,
a reason why,
yeah,
right? Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And then sort of Born in the USA is like a sentimental favorite because it was the family car trip album. I really love my brother and I really love Bobby Jean. Actually, that's like an inside song for us. Like it's
Yeah.
like a brother sister song. So
Oh, how fun.
when he pulls Bobby Jean out at a show, I get really excited. I know some people think it's really corny, but I love that one.
Hmm.
So, in fact, my best friend and I put a quote from it on our like yearbook page together.
Hmm.
Um, so that yeah, I would say that's like a sentimental favorite. There's a bunch of those from Born in the USA. Like we also really love Downbound Train in my family.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like sing it, when things are going south.
Before the novel, what were you writing?
Before the novel, that's a good question. Was a pop culture journalist.
Okay.
I still am, but now I'm an editor. So I was for like the years, sort of the early 2010s to mid 2010s before I became a parent. I was writing constantly about movies, books, TV shows, music, a little bit about music, writing some of those like lists, that used to go really
Sure.
viral in that era, like the 50 scariest haunted houses in literature and little like essays about, like the pleasure. I wrote one about going to 20 Springsteen shows or like the pleasure of rereading your favorite YA
Yeah.
novel and things like that. And then I was also writing short stories. I got an MFA in 2012 and worked on short stories a lot during that period. I was writing a lot of internet journalism and some investigative pieces and some reporting. I did some big long form reporting projects. And so I'm like, I call myself a generalist as a writer. I can do a little bit of everything. But the novel was, writing fiction is my first love because of all the early readings.
Yeah.
Around,
So
oh, go ahead.
let's talk about it. So it's
Yeah.
called The Singer Sisters. Do you got your elevator pitch ready?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I have like a galley copy right here under my.
Yay.
I love the cover with the guitar.
Yeah.
It is two generations of singers in one family. So 60s and 90s, folk and rock music, family secrets and lies, and two generations going up and down through fame, in and out of fame and fortune. The book is full of lyrics, so they all put their feelings about each other into their songs and listen to each other's songs and sing them to each other on stage. There's a lot of drama expressed through song, family drama. So it's really like a mashup of a family saga and a rock novel.
And you talked a little bit about growing up with music, and that was part of the inspiration for that. Tell me a little bit more about that.
So in some ways, the characters, I mean, they're very much their own characters, and they're two generations of, mostly focused on strong women in both generations, but there's also some male characters, and it's in some ways about that relationship between the millennials slash Generation X and the baby boomers and the music of the boomers and how influential it was on all the music that came afterwards. And so my main character, Emma, who's growing up in the 90s, is, her mother quit music a long time ago and it's kind of reclusive and mysterious. But she's like one of those iconic 60s songwriters. And her daughter feels a lot of pressure because all her friends and all her fellow musicians are influenced by her parents. And the music that everyone wants to do is influenced by her parents' generation and their friends. So it's about trying to kind of break out of their shadow while also loving and respecting them, which is kind of like what we're all always doing with our parents as we grow up. So it's sort of that kind of thing expressed through music and the cataclysmic influence of the 60s and 70s in music and pop culture and how everything, it shook everything up and people were making these huge advances. Bruce is one example, Dylan, Joni Mitchell in songwriting, like living through this golden age of songwriting.
And I do think that I'm fascinated by a second generation, right? The idea that, how do you step out of your parents' shadow, especially in the arts,
Yeah.
right? Or in athletics.
Yeah.
I could see that you're like, wow, okay, what do I do? And yeah, so I think that is absolutely right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Exactly. And I think, there's this, it's really interesting. There was this whole like Nepo baby discussion like a year or two ago in the media, like with all these young kids of celebrities. And, there's a lot to criticize about these systems that privilege connections and, the kids, but also it's like, well, when two really creative people have a kid, like, what do you think is going to happen? Like I think about that with my main character, like she's kind of cursed because her mom is a legendary songwriter. Her dad is a kind of James Taylory figure who loves performing, loves the stage, and like,
yeah.
they have two kids, and their kids also really like playing guitar and coming it up on stage because that's their legacy. So it's tricky. You could say that she's sort of spoiled and expects the world to come to her because of her parents, but also she has the drive to make art. That's her inheritance. So it's an interesting set of conflicts for her to navigate.
Yeah, because I think one of my favorite artists is a singer-songwriter named John Hyatt that is not as well known as some, but he wrote Are You Ready for This Thing Called Love that Bonnie Raitt did.
Right.
His song Have a Little Faith has been used in tons of movies and songs. And so he's has a really strong Americana following. And his daughter is Lily Hyatt. And so she's performing. And it is, I always think that's interesting. you grew up with that art,
Hmm.
right? You grew up with that kind of thought, and of course you're going to be drawn to that kind of life. And it's one thing if your parents like, well, I don't know if I ever wanted you to have this life because it's so hard, but how could it not be, right?
Yeah.
If
Right.
when you see that and you have that in your genes.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And her mom really wants her to have a fallback plan and graduate college and kind of keep the music on the back burner until she has a more stable life. She wants to go out and go for it, just like her parents did. One of the big arcs of the book is sort of both her mother, whose name is Judy, and Emma coming to understand each other because Emma sees how hard it actually is to be a woman in the music industry and, why her mom comes to understand why her mom was so concerned for her. And her mom also just comes to appreciate that everyone has to make their own mistakes and learn through experience. You can't warn your kids off doing what they have to do in
Yeah.
life.
What surprised you as you were working with the characters and writing them?
That's a great question. I think what surprised me, honestly, is how the primary immediate inspiration for the book was the Wainwright McGarrigle family. They're a family of folk singers. The sisters are Kate and Anna McGarrigle. They're Canadian
Okay.
folk singers. Kate's kids are Rufus Wainwright and Martha Wainwright, who are both singer-songwriters and kind of the more poppy folk genre. And I saw them all play together at a Pete Seeger tribute concert. And then,
Hmm.
like 7 years later, I was like, I should write a novel about a folk singing family. But so that was the initial inspiration. But I think what surprised me was realizing how much of a like all this pop culture stuff I'd accumulated over decades of reading Entertainment Weekly and Rolling Stone, reading pop culture history books, watching documentaries on VH1 and MTV, like behind the music, and watching Woodstock concert movies all the time before we had Netflix. We just had cable, and like I used to keep the Palladia, the concert film channel, just on in the background, and like I watched like Woodstock and Monterey Pop and Bruce in Barcelona like over and over and over again. So how much all that stuff had kind of just like become part of my subconscious and my fabric, and so how fun it was when it came time to write to be able to pull some of these funny details out and pop them in, like whether it was about like LA in the early 2000s or about New York City in the 70s when things were kind of seedy. It was just very fun to play with some of those details that I'd
Yeah.
absorbed.
Did you hear their music?
Yes, sort of yes and no. I mean, I don't think that I heard it in any kind of sophisticated way that I could put music to it, but I definitely kind of heard the rhythm. And I had, for all the big songs in the book, I had like two or three reference songs kind of in my mind. On the Road song, and
Yeah.
there's some torch ballads, and so they were all kind of like, oh, this should sound like, in my mind, this should sound like a James Taylor song, or this would be like a Joni Mitchell song, or this one's going to sound like Alanis, or or Bruce, or
Hmm.
some of the when we're driving now with my parents, we sometimes listen to the Bridge, the Sirius XM station that's like
Yeah.
soft rock from the 70s, and I'm always like, that's like when one of my characters kind of like sells out and makes like a soft rock album in the 70s, like it's the Bridge, like nothing wrong with it, I love it. But so yeah, there's definitely some reference points and sort of like a rhythm and some music, and I try to put some clues in to the description of the songs, just like how they sounded, like whether they had a lot of
Yeah.
instrumentation or fast
I
or
haven't read it yet.
yes, there are lyrics. Yeah.
Is that did that use a different muscle for you?
Yeah. The lyric writing was so fun. I mean, everyone's like, "Oh, are you gonna write songs now?" I'm like, "Why?" It was so, like I sometimes think like, well, lyrics are they're kind of like, not unrefined poetry.
Sure.
A little bit like sort of more corny because you don't have to be quite as precise with lyrics because you have the music to help you. So you can rhyme you and two. There's nothing wrong, like it's great.
Yeah.
The best writers do it. And so that was very liberating, I think, right? Because I had studied writing poetry in college, and much preferred writing prose. But then when it came time to write these lyrics, it was just like a complete joy and so fun. And most of the novel is completely rewritten from the first draft, but a lot of the lyrics are still there from the
Oh,
first draft.
wow.
And I did tweak them a bit, but
Yeah.
yeah.
The what was the toughest part of it writing for you? What was the struggle? Was there a scenes or a storyline that you struggled a little bit with?
I think that the part that I had to work the hardest at, and that was the biggest challenge for me, was just structuring the book as a whole, because I'd never written a full book before, and I did end up restructuring it so that the first third of the book flips back and forth through time between the mother and daughter's perspectives and sort of culminates in a big fight that they have. So you're kind of seeing them both leading up to it. And then it goes back to being chronological towards the end. But yeah, that part, working that out and figuring out that it wasn't going to be a traditional structure was definitely the hardest part. And I went into COVID with a linear with a linear
Mhm.
novel, and I didn't have time to work on it for a while because I was home with my kids and working. And then when I kind of started working on it again as the lockdown eased a little bit, so that like a year and a half later, 2 years later, the first thing I did was decide to like blow up the structure. Um, and that took a long time. Because then I was like, oh, so I'm starting in the middle, and there's all the stuff now that my readers won't understand, and I have to like figure out how to portion out all this information in a way that makes sense. Really challenging. It was fun, but it was challenging.
Creatively, why did you decide that was the right choice?
I felt that so the back narrative, which I love, and some readers have said is definitely their favorite part. I think people have different reactions to it. Is a very classic like story of a teenager in the '60s runs away, goes to Greenwich Village to join the folk scene, and it felt like the scenes in the 1990s where Emma, the protagonist of the '90s part of the book, is trying to break out as a rock star, felt like more dangerous and urgent and kind of mysterious. And so it felt like that needed to be the emotional beginning of the book to anchor it. And that finding out her mom's story kind of as she finds it out made it much more suspenseful.
That makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense. So what's next? What do you want to do now? What's the next creative endeavor? Obviously, spending a lot of time promoting this one. So what's next for you creatively?
I am working on a new manuscript. It's in really early phases. So I have no idea. Like it's possible that I write the whole thing and then just like, throw it in the garbage and start a new one, because I tend to just write really messy first drafts before I
Okay.
can even figure out if anything is worth it, worth keeping.
Okay.
And there's actually a Bruce concert in the books at the moment.
Nice. Good.
Or at least driving home from a Bruce.
Um so it appears the book, the Eve version is already ready.
Yes, there's
It
an audiobook version and an ebook.
okay. And then you in the hardback as well, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So The Singer Sisters, a novel. So what should I have asked you that I haven't, Sarah? And I'm going to
Um,
get to the Sarah of Mary question in a minute, but is there something else I should have asked you that I haven't?
well, you could ask me what I think of Bruce as a lyricist.
I would love that. So yes, in fact, I about a year and a half ago, I ended up getting 4 or 5 writers on a round table, and they all came with 3 nominations of what was Bruce's best written song.
Ooh,
Not his best song, not your favorite song, but the song you think that, you know, structurally or however story wise do you think's the best. I say this once and I wish I could find it, Sarah. A few years ago for April Fool's Day, somebody did an article that said that Bruce was a Pulitzer Prize winning writer, and they did an article, basically every album was a book, and they talked about like some of them were collections of short stories, some of them
yeah,
were a novel, one of that, and I was like, I want to live in that alternate universe. That would
yeah,
be a cool universe.
yeah,
So yes, talk to me about Bruce as a writer.
yeah. I mean, so I think his like lyrics are very poetic, but he really shines as a storyteller. He's so good at creating that like the building tension and mystery in such a short amount of time. And a really interesting thing that I've been thinking about a lot is I saw the music writer Rob Sheffield on his book tour for his Taylor Swift book, and he was talking a lot about Taylor and Bruce and how they share that quality of being like storytellers and like the 3 minute story in a song. and how they can, both, and it's through the lyrics, like they add sort of one or two lines where you're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
As a listener, like what's gonna happen next? And create, like pathos and sympathy for characters who are doing not such good things.
Yeah.
I mean, that's all, right, like what you dream of being able to do as a writer. So, and we all talk about his characters like they're real to us. And
Yeah.
so, and he's so good at that. I don't know anyone who's written more songs for movies where he is writing as a character, like, like somebody like just Bruce Springsteen, like watch this movie and then write a song from
Yeah.
the point of view of the protagonist, and he just does it with like so effectively. That's very impressive because you're always drawing from yourself as a writer, but you also have to be able to project yourself into these characters who are really different from you, and he's really the best at that in some ways.
Yeah. I remember I was talking to another writer, and it was during the pandemic. We were all in lockdown, and we were talking, it was Ron Martz, and we were talking about how good the radio shows were, right? Like From My Home to Yours. I don't know if you heard any of them on Sirius XM, but and Ron said, we know he's a great storyteller. Why are we surprised that he doesn't excel in any format of storytelling he wants to tell?
Yeah,
And, I really do think that you learn more in a 3-minute record than we ever heard in school, right?
yeah,
And I think like Western Stars is a collection of, it could be, I mean, it could feel like a collection of short stories from Elmer Leonard,
yeah,
that feeling. And it's very cool.
yeah. Or like the Ghost of Tom Joad. I mean, the way he like I always think about that because I'm like, oh, there was a novel by Steinbeck and then the movie
Yeah.
and that influenced Bruce, and then Rage did their version, and it's just like this American story that's like being translated into all these different mediums.
All right. So in a few minutes, I'm going to ask you for any final thoughts, how to reach you. But before we do that, I end every podcast with what I call the Mary question, Sarah.
Yeah.
And what that is, Jay Armstrong, speaking of writers, he is now retired, but when he was a high school English teacher, he would give his students the lyrics to Thunder Road, and they would read it as if it was a poem. And they would discuss, this was his honors English teacher students. They would discuss it. They'd debate on the visions and the imagery Bruce talks about. And then he would ask his class, does Mary get in the car? Do you think Mary gets in the car at the end of Thunder Road?
So the obvious answer for me is yes. I mean, it's like that song is my, like, as a woman, I'm like, if somebody's paying me Thunder Road, I would get in the car. From like
Yes.
a literary perspective, it's obviously more fun to think of it as sort of a failed plea,
Yes.
where he's putting everything on the line, and then he ends up going off on his own anyway. Um, so my super ego is, as a writer, is like, well, it probably didn't work because it's so desperate. But like for me as a fan, like 100% she gets in the
I
car.
love that answer. Jay, when he was first on the podcast telling me this story, I was like, well, of course she gets in the car. I mean, there's not even a debate. And he talked about that he thinks she doesn't, and it makes him like the song more, right? He gets into this whole thing about choices means you choose one thing and you give up something else. And he said, would she have given up her fear? Because that's what it would have been, right? So yeah, I think it's a great discussion. A lot of people have fun thoughts about it.
Yeah, I think it's such a great question. And it's true, like if you look at his body of work, there aren't too many successful like people
No,
who leave town, start over, and everything
yeah,
goes great. So if you think of it in that context, it's very hard to sort of separate it as the greatest rock and roll song ever written from like how it was originally and why it's the greatest rock and roll song ever written,
yeah,
because it has that sort of desperation and big question mark
yeah,
behind it.
yeah. There is a podcast called Strong Songs, and he breaks down different songs and kind of talks about musically what happens and lyrically it happens. And he did Born to Run a few months ago, and I after listening to it, I love it even more. But he talks about, right, that, ultimately they aren't getting out, right? On Border Run, you go right, but until then, tramps like us,
Right, right.
is, and you, we also would talk about, he often will talk about songs with a past. His characters have a past
Yeah,
and
yeah,
they're trying to, redeem themselves, which is great.
yeah, yeah. It is. And for a novelist, like there's so much rich material there. So
Hmm.
yeah, yeah.
Sarah, this was so wonderful. Thank you so much.
Oh, I had so much fun.
All right. So if someone wants to reach you, how can they?
So, well, everything is changing so rapidly on our social media environment at this this moment. It's Sarah with an H, M Seltzer, like seltzer water,
Okay.
everywhere. So Blue Sky and Instagram are the ones that I'm using the most right now. And my website is Sarah with an H, mseltzer.com. You can,
All right.
so yeah, some,
Any final thoughts?
no, I think it's just been a pleasure. And I love leaving with the thinking about Bruce the storyteller. And, this is going to inspire my writing tomorrow to think about
Oh,
the way he creates tension and mystery in such a short time. That's hashtag goals for
nice.
my next writing session. So
Well, great.
you like Bruce?
Yeah. So the book is Singer Sisters
Mhm.
by Sarah Seltzer, available everywhere books are.
It is
Uh,
everywhere.
yes, and check it out
Yeah,
and let her know what you think. All right. So if you end up getting this next one, you got to come back and help promote it. Okay.
absolutely.
All right, sounds great. Well, listeners, go check out the book, sign up for the newsletter. Let Sarah know you heard about it here. I want to thank Sarah for joining me. I want you, listeners, to be safe, be kind, and we'll talk to you soon. Goodbye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Set Lusting Bruce. I hope you enjoyed it, and I also hope you check out other episodes of the podcast. I'm going to go through some housekeeping items here on how to contact me and some of my other projects, so please hang around. I'm still on Twitter, aka X, at Jesse Jackson DFW. The show is also on Twitter at Set Lusting Bruce. I and the show have a Facebook page. Please go there and like us. I'm part of a few other podcasts. On Perfectly Good Podcast, me and my co host Sylvan are talking about every John Hyatt song in alphabetical order. Set Lusting Bruce and Perfectly Good Podcast are part of the Pantheon Podcast Network, where we have hundreds of shows dedicated to music. Please check them out. My good friend Charles and I continue to talk all things Doctor Who on Next Stop Everywhere. Lou, Karen, and I talk about pulp culture topics on the JKL Media Podcast. I would love to hear your feedback. Please send me an email to setlustingbruce@gmail.com. You can leave a voicemail, 469 249 2442. Go to iTunes to rate and review any of the podcasts I'm on, and we will read them on the show. Please tell me what you like, tell me what you dislike. Hook me up with someone you think would be a great guest. Getting to talk to people about their experiences, whether it be music or other creative endeavors, is my passion. And I hope these conversations bring you a little joy, a little peace, and a whole lot of love. Keep hope alive.
There's a joke here somewhere, it's on me. Shake this world off my shoulders. Come on, baby, have a laugh on